Narnia. Nerds in Paradise. The potentially blossoming relationship between Nigel Nickleby, Digibeet's co-founder and lead engineer, and Lilly Dobson, his long-suffering secretary, was often derailed whenever Lilly attempted to share something deep and meaningful. And this inevitably happened at the Technode, Digibeet's offices and workplace, which bristled with distractions for Nigel. The unfortunate result was that he would normally respond to Lilly's open-hearted intimacies with, "Uh-huh, oh, really?" Unfortunately, these weren't always in the correct order, and clear proof that Nigel had not heard a word that Lilly had said. So, in an attempt to awaken what she was convinced lay dormant in Nigel's heart, Lilly thought it prudent to get him alone and undistracted. And to do that, she decided to take Nigel on a little excursion. So she took him up to Hankie Hall National Museum, a one-time sugar plantation, located on a hill overlooking the beautiful Caribbean Ocean. Her cover story was to fill him in on some of the island's history, but in reality it was to provide a few special moments in an idyllic environment, which would hopefully lead to a little staring into each other's eyes. At least that's what Lilly dreamed of. Not too far from Hankie Hall lived Herbert McNevis, whose chickens were responsible for producing a remarkable quantity of very large and very tasty eggs. The prime cause of the chickens' success was the special mix of chicken feed, nutmeg and coffee grounds that Herbert had concocted in the middle of one of his frequent sleepless nights. And like many people with hyperactive imaginations, Herbert suffered from creative chaos syndrome, which meant that he could have 5 brilliant ideas before breakfast, only to have them all derailed by 5 very different ideas before lunch. If he remembered lunch, that was. In Herbert's case, he had learned to limit his passions to coffee and robotics, and he couldn't quite make up his mind which he loved best. What he did know, though, was that the Digibeet team were predominantly European, or something like that, with a sprinkling of other coffee-loving nationalities. And they were all seriously high-tech nerds, and doubtless knew all there was to know about robotics. Though he, like many of Banania's population, didn't actually drink coffee very much, Herbert himself dreamed of becoming a big-time barista, rather than a small-time chicken farmer. And this was due to him having once seen a photograph in a glossy magazine of a smiling professional serving an Americano to an even more loudly smiling customer. Such was the impact of the photograph that Herbert's life was never to be the same again. He immediately decided to set up Cincinnati's best coffee company, believing that Cincinnati was a suburb of Seattle, and dreamt of using robots as baristas to create consistent cups of the blessed brew. But to do those things he needed to immerse himself in both worlds. Herbert's strategy was to deliver a cup of coffee to each of the Digibeet team, with a copy of his robotical barista concept neatly folded beneath each coffee cup. when the cup was lifted to the coffee drinker's lips, his concept would be discovered and fervently read. The text was designed to ignite the reader's imagination and inspire them to employ him as an intern, and then to share all their precious super high-tech secrets with him. So, early one morning, Herbert, dressed in his smartest suit, normally reserved for funerals and more formal weddings, he left his long-suffering wife to feed the chickens and collect the abundance of eggs, and, armed with a pocketful of robotical barista leaflets printed at the local internet cafe, he arrived at Manta Ray Bay Resort's kitchen. There he persuaded Jemima Dobson to let him use her filter coffee machine to create 8 cups of strong black coffee. Now, normally Jemmy Dobson would never allow anybody even near her kitchen, but this was Herbert, who faithfully delivered the island's biggest and most tasty eggs. So for him, she made an exception. Meanwhile, Nigel and Lilly's potentially romantic outing to Hankie Hall was sadly becoming a prime example of Nigel being, Nigel, really. Having spent some significant time reading the museum's brochure, which included a detailed explanation of how sugar was refined, Lilly thought to impress Nigel with a deeper, more knowledgeable side of herself, by giving her own rendition of the sugar refining process. True to form, though, Nigel's growing admiration of Lilly's prowess got rudely sidetracked by his engineer's brain, which immediately concocted an alternative, much more efficient way of refining sugar. And this would involve using their new solar-intensified weed burner and food griller, and to make it really effective and even more ecologically sound, it would also use a modified version of their super-efficient windmiller to both grind the cane and feed the fire with pressurized oxygen. A few days later, back at the Manta Ray Bay Resort, Herbert proceeded to carry the newly prepared coffee on a tray to the Digibeet team, scattered all over the Technode. He finished delivering the final half-empty cups of tepid, black, heavily sweetened coffee to the remote members of the team. And being the kind-hearted people that they were, they didn't feel it appropriate to dim his enthusiasm by telling him that they had a perfectly acceptable coffee machine within just a few meters of where they were working. And sadly, not only was Herbert's coffee cold and much diminished in volume, having slopped out of the cups, but it had left his promotional tracts a mess of mushy, brown, rapidly dissolving paper, unreadable and unread, floating in the puddle of slopped-over coffee. And tragically, Herbert had also failed to realise that perhaps some people might prefer something different to the strong, black brew steeped in several spoonfuls of sugar. In spite of the tepid, undrinkable coffee interruption, though, the whole Digibeet team dived once more into perfecting the Hankie Hall sugar refining process, as Herbert slunk away to rethink his strategy. Now when the great day came, the wind blew strong and steady from the sea, and the sun shone as only the Caribbean sun knew how. All the technology was in place to give the Hankie Hall sugar mill a new and significantly more efficient lease of life. The Digibeet team were excited to be doing their part in resurrecting a piece of Banania's history. The one person who was not at all happy about the attention given to Hankie Hall, though, was Doris Dutherby. Devious Doris had devised a plan to sabotage the technology. A grand failure would ensure that she and her father were still able to get Hankie Hall, their ancestral home, returned to them. This had been promised by the naughty neighbouring island of Euphonia, once they had invaded and occupied Banania. The payment for this was a little intelligence gathering and the occasional bit of sabotage by Doris and her father. Well, unusually, Digibeet's new super-efficient carbon-free technology seemed to be functioning perfectly. The mill's ancient rollers, powered by a modified version of the Digibeet windmiller, crushed and squeezed happily. The precisely concentrated solar-powered heater boiled and crystallized the resulting juice with furious efficiency. Control lights glowed reassuringly, and the bank of digital displays read out with remarkable clarity. Warm, light brown sugar crystals with a sticky side order of deep brown molasses was being produced with breathtaking efficiency. All would have continued working wonderfully, but for Doris, who snuck stealthily around the back of the mill, grabbed the large flexible pipe which vented the windmiller's air output and deftly removed it from its retaining bracket. Then she forcefully rammed it into the cool air intake at the bottom of the mill wall. And to compound the effect, at that moment the wind strength began to pick up, and the amount of air being sucked in increased significantly. But it wasn't cooling air that got sucked in, it was the increasingly hot exhaust air. After a very short while, the now supercharged heater got more and more out of control and reached very high temperatures indeed. At one point, the temperature got so high that the liquid sugar reached ignition point. And with a deafening roar, the molten molasses exploded, sending an enormous fireball of burning liquid sugar out through the top of the mill. The wicked wind, which had helped things to get so severely out of hand, had one more nasty little trick up its sleeve. As the fireball reached its full height, to be clearly seen with fear and trembling from the nearby island of Euphonia, an extra strong gust of wind caught it up, dragged it across the sky, then simply stopped blowing, letting the still extremely hot liquid sugar fall out of the sky right onto the adjacent car park, and all over Digibeet's ancient minibus. Running to the rescue, the team were just in time to scrape the rapidly cooling liquid off the windows and open the vehicle's doors. This they did before it set, in a rock-hard and highly glossy light brown covering. As it covered large patches of the bus's drab green surface, it became an almost impenetrable and very convincing camouflage. After it had cooled, the coating was so effective that any vehicle unwise enough to run into or scrape the side of the bus would limp away in crumpled disgrace, while leaving the bus completely unscathed. Meanwhile, at the Manta Ray Bay Resort, Demi Dobson perceived the passion and dedication that lurked beneath Herbert's evangelistic exterior. In order to fulfill his dream and protect everybody's taste buds and digestive systems, Demi kindly offered to take him on as intern.